The Between Two Lines podcast, talking about performance, life, and everything in between. Featuring your hosts, Jonny Stahl and Ash Hamilton.
Thank you for joining Ash and I for episode 7 of the Between Two Lines podcast, where we talk about performance, life, and everything in between. This week was all about goal setting with clients, setting not just goals, however, rather expectations and putting plans in place to help those we work with. The way we communicate to clients and patients is massive, and Ash and I take a deep dive into a bunch of scenarios with some cool takeaways for each. This is sort of stuff which isn't really learnt at uni, and in theory it seems like simple stuff until you have a variety of rather complex clients or stories, emotions sitting right in front of you. So it's a really cool topic, and I'm really glad that we shared our thoughts, shared our information, and shared our experiences above all. So it's time to get started, and I've got no doubt you'll find the talk today extremely interesting. Big dog, how are you, mate?
Not too bad, man. Not too bad. What is it? 3rd of Jan. It's flying already.
Of Jan. We're buzzing.
2022.
Start of the new year, the new work week of the new year. So what's that bringing you, big boy? What's the plans within that?
For today or just the year?
Both really. I guess more so the year.
This year's a big one, I think. I think last year was kind of like digging in the trenches, kind of finding out a lot of the linchpins to my own psychology, a lot of learnings, a lot of first times for things. And I think this year I want to take the summation of lessons and things that I found and take it forward and really start actioning a lot of ideas that I've had for a very long time. So yeah, that's kind of 2022, man, is just action, and kind of like bring a lot of these ideas to fruition. So it's exciting. It's also kind of nerve-wracking because it's one thing to kind of have this idea in your head, and then it becomes 2022 and you're like, all right, it's now the year that you said you were going to do those things. Have you started? When are you starting? So
it's like, fuck, it's
yeah,
already
man.
day 3.
Yeah, it's like, whew. So what about yourself? 2022, what's kind of like the theme? What's the theme for you?
I'd say growth in terms of, I guess, a lot of things. Last year was my first full year overseas, and I guess like a similar situation, just trying to figure out like a new environment, new situation. First time living with my living with a partner, and it's been virtually almost a year and a half now since I've been here. So
yeah, wow.
just trying to like processing all of that, which was pretty cool, pretty interesting. But now I'm buzzing to start to really spread my wings and I guess put my own flavor on a bunch of things here in Berlin, and I guess with the online work that I'm doing. And as you can see, I got my party shirt out. So
yeah,
I got about 15 of these horrendously colored and shaped shirts. So
do you actually? Gee.
Oh man, and I might have like 10 here, and I got probably at least another 5 or 10 back in Oz. So yeah, man, no, I'm super excited.
You just collect them, or because I remember at uni we used to have like shit shirt parties, and like they were kind of like the vibe people used to wear. But I reckon they're great.
I would have taken everyone to the fucking cleaners at a shit shirt party. I can tell you that.
Really?
I got the shittest of the shit. I don't know. I actually bought this in Berlin maybe 4 years ago when I was here. 5 years ago, I was here to visit with my 2 brothers, and was just in a secondhand shop and bought like three of these. I guess sort of retro style shit shirts, and it kind of became my style. Like every time I'd go out, like I remember going out to the SB every week with my mates. All my mates have like their button up shirt and their slacks or whatever on, and I'm just rocking up with one of these shirts on and all sweaty and just having the time of my life, just throwing my limbs everywhere. Yeah, gotta rock that style. So I learned at some point not to try and be anyone else rather than myself. So that feels way better, my man. So
what about the hat? The hat in the background, the Christmas tree hat. Is that all? Sorry.
So for anyone listening, we've got can you see my Christmas tree in the background is still up, and there's just a hat on top because we forgot to we got to Christmas Eve, and both my girlfriend's parents and my parents are coming over, and we forgot to buy a star for the top of it. So she just put a hat on top. It's just like, yeah, that'll do. So yeah. Poor us, but nah, life's good, man.
Yeah, wow.
Life's good. I want to start the podcast with a couple of questions. First one, what were your biggest successes and fails with your training last year? What were the best and worst things you did?
Um, I think a failure in itself was I did not train nearly enough. I think
Mhm.
that's definitely a big goal for 2022 is kind of take back to my own training. I think I fell out of love for training the last few years. Like still
Mm.
trained, but it just didn't get me up and about like it used to. So I think that was definitely a massive kind of fail in itself. Um, I'm just trying to think specifically whether there was a certain protocol interventions I kind of did. And there's nothing that kind of comes to the forefront. I started getting back on the cardio again. That was kind of like a fail in the start, just getting like my steady state cardio up. But that also was probably one of the best things I did.
Mm.
And I realized the importance not only of having a cardio baseline for health, but also how it makes you feel. Um, so yeah, I think that was kind of like, as I said, there wasn't really much training done in 2021 to kind of like talk about, but they're kind of like, yeah, I don't know, nothing really comes to mind, man. I did a lot of trial, a lot of experimenting
Mm.
with my own training. Was like, trialing and implementing some things that I would then implement in a rehab setting. So I kind of like was like, all right, if I'm not really going to train hard, is my training going to be advantageous in some way? And I kind of was a bit like, all right, let's see what this is like, and I'm all about trialing something before you give it to a client. Um, so that was definitely something I played around with. What about yourself, man? How about your training? Did you train more than me?
Yeah, well, we had 7 months of lockdown here, and I moved to Berlin from Australia, and I just like on my third day here, I found a football club, a soccer club, and I just I got to training. I trained super well. I hadn't played football for like a year, and I somehow just I was like, I won't even be able to lift my legs properly or touch the ball, and I was played really well, and they're like, yep, come join our team. And then after like 4 or 5 games, the season got suspended or stopped because of COVID, and then I'd been sprint training um, before I moved to Berlin, and then I got back on that wagon, and I just did 6 months of dedicated sprint training, and so I did that 3 times a week. And I remember there were times where it was snowing. It had been snowing, so the grass was literally ice, and I was just trying to run on it, and you could not run more than 75-80% of your max speed because you'd literally just slide. How do I explain this best? You'd land on the ground, and then because it's so slippery, you'd virtually just butt kick out the back, and your leg would just fall out the back behind you, and so you'd end up just
Yeah.
basically you'd just be doing this controlled chaotic stumble the whole time. So that was probably the biggest fail, but I was just still dedicated. I was like, I'm doing my 3 times a week. I don't care if it's -8. I'm going out. I'm going to do it. I'm going to just get it done. Um, and so and then I guess some of the sprint training was amazing. Like I learned so much, and that's the sort of stuff that I implement with clients now. And it's been so beneficial just doing it for like a solid block of 6 months, really 9 months,
What kind
even
of
8 months.
what kind of distances?
60 meters max. I focus a lot on the technical side, and I trial a lot of different things. So, for my own learning, but also experimentation for clients, like as you were saying. And that was amazing, man. So there were some fails within it, but also when you just I just put together a couple of different drills that I trial, like more change of direction drills, and it just didn't work, and kind of had to laugh a little bit, but that's all part of it. Like I do it with a mate a lot of the time who was in my team, and just try some things like, yep, okay, sorry mate, that was crap, but we'll just pretend that never happened, and we'll kick on. But the ideal thing is you do that once and you do it on yourself, and then you're like, yep, okay, that doesn't work. Your brain doesn't forget that, and then you find an alternative, and you start to use that with in your own professional practices. So that was a really, really interesting experience through the European winter, to just be out 3 times a week sprint training, and then doing some strength sessions, because of the gyms were closed. People would just grab rocks, and there was like this, like a couple of bars and stuff like that, and people would just be using rocks and throwing rocks above their head, and using these massive stones for anything. Just in the park, it was awesome. The creativity was amazing. It was like almost like it was like strongman style, strongman environment, strongman setup with more controlled gym lifts. So
yeah, wow.
Or like traditional strength lifts. So yeah, it was fucking cool actually. Now that I look back on that, it was a pretty cool experience.
It's Yeah. You continue.
No, that was it. Yeah, it's just an interesting 6 months there where it was just, yeah, everything. And I was also new to the city, so I just kind of took everything as I was going. I didn't know my way around that well, so everything was all new to me. But I look back at that now, and I just think that was quite funny, really. Like it's just pretty hilarious. But
It's
yeah, it's awesome.
It's prompted actually a few memories now I think about it. There's a few things I actually tried. So it's not really I guess training, but I tried slack rope, like the rope between two trees. And that was an interesting experience. Like, really kind of like learning to focus on the horizon and kind of like be able to modulate your feet in the right position without kind of like falling off and breaking your neck. That was something I tried. Another thing I tried was sandbag training. A good friend from Melbourne, Laura Gould. Now she's going to kill me if I don't pronounce her last name correctly, but she got me into this. She's doing this a lot of training by StrongFit.
Yep.
And StrongFit, they talk a lot about, and it's very interesting how they talk about kind of like parasympathetic and sympathetic kind of like chains in the body. And they talk about internal and external torque. And internal torque is kind of like, being able to kind of like get that pronation, your adductors, your obliques, kind of like, it's like a fascial sling in a way. And being able to kind of create this tension from like a bottoms up approach. And you do a lot of sandbag carries. So she actually got me to carry, I don't know what it was, like a 40-kilo sandbag for 400 meters. And man, like I'd never done it before. And like in the beginning, it's cool, you're sweet, like it's 40 kilos. But then as you do it, if you don't do it correctly and you don't create this, I guess, torque, this internal torque, you start feeling in your lower back. And you had to kind of like self-regulate and kind of like self-organize to get into a position where your lower back wasn't frying. Because man, your lower back would scream if you didn't do it the right way. But then if you did it the right way, it kind of recruited all these muscles. And the interesting thing is they say that this is correlated to more of a parasympathetic kind of like chain. And it's funny because afterwards I felt so calm, so relaxed, and actually wanted to sleep, kind of like a rest and digest. And it felt different to I've smashed myself, I'm tired, now I feel like sleeping. It was a very weird sensation. So that was a type of training that I actually had not done ever before. And it was a bit of a rabbit hole I still have quite a desire to kind of get into. I've just been quite lazy. So that was something I tried. And then an experience that failed was there's a gym in Melbourne called Pro Raw. And I guess it has, state of the art equipment. And me and my mate rock up and we sort would just warm up on the calibrated plates with deadlifts. And we started warming up and then we started seeing these, I guess, smaller women, like, half our size. Not that you should ever judge a book. And man, they started chucking all this weight on the thing. We looked at each other and we're like, we're gonna have to go way heavier than we should today. And it's like both of us were thinking like, we haven't deadlifted in ages. Like, let's just be sensible. Like, set to 120, piss weight, right? Next second, 160s on the bar. And we're like, trying to keep everything tight. And man, by like the fifth set, we're both looking at each other being like, man, my back is that close to being fucked. Like we're like, and we can't just leave because we're at Pro Raw and we don't want to be the guys that just did 5 sets of deadlifts and left. So like we walk over to the pendulum squat and we both looked at each other and we're like, I don't even care. There's no weight on there. And they're like, man, yeah, it was one of those, there's a reason why you don't ego lift. And there's a reason why you warm up and do all the correct things. But that was kind of like it was a fun session, but also a stupid session. So that was definitely probably the standout stupidest thing I did with my training this year.
I was going to say, it sounds like someone's ego got in the way.
Yeah. And the thing is, it's like, it's not like 160 is a large amount of weight either. Like it's enough that you can get away with it, but it was also enough to kind of leave us being like, oh, yep, that does not feel good. I won't be bending over to pick up my shoes anytime soon. So yeah, man.
Funny. Let's tuck into some of the more serious stuff. Although we never try to be too serious, do we, Ashley? And I think one thing that we really wanted to discuss was talking to clients and client goals and getting out what we need from the clients and also giving them what they want. So the way I see things is that, I try to marry what I think they need and what they tell me that they want. And there's obviously a large process within that, or it can be a large process. And our goal is obviously to simplify that as much as possible, but also to be, polite, and I don't want to say charming, but, show that we're trustworthy and that they can trust us and that they're in a good environment and all of that. So my question to you is, how do you go about that? And how do you tend to negotiate different types of clients? So I'll give you two clear examples. One is a guy comes in, say he's a bodybuilder. I know that you've worked a lot with bodybuilding populations, and he's quite a proactive, let's say aggressive person. I don't mean literally aggressive mentally, but I mean physically, in terms of, he'd like to have a crack with his training, and he's quite, he likes to be quite aggressive with the training process, versus someone who's particularly timid and fearful, perhaps not an avid lifter, maybe a runner who's had a long history of pain, and has that kind of, sort of let's say more of a chronic pain type presentation or response, and her reactions to the pain and stuff really suggest that she's sort of struggling in that sense. How do you go about managing and negotiating those two scenarios?
Good question. And I think when you look at the two different presentations, there's a few things you got to take into consideration. And I think the first one is with the bodybuilder. They've usually spent time in the gym. They're usually quite aware of movement patterns. They're usually quite aware of what's worked for them, and they've probably tried different approaches. So with them, the first thing you got to think about is buy-in. And it's like, if you were to kind of regress things or kind of take a slower approach and be like, look, we're going to work on basic movement patterns. I know you can do this, but we're going to strip it right back. You're probably going to lose them. And the other thing you got to think about is how many tools or how complicated are you going to make things? And by complicated, I kind of mean giving things to people. Now, I always tell people that there's kind of like a continuum, and it's like, I think nutrition's a great way to kind of like talk about this, because it's like, how committed are you to nutrition? Because you can talk nutrition with someone, and by no means am I a nutritionist and I don't do meal plans, but it's like, do we just need to have a look at what you do? Like, how aware are you of nutrition? And like with a very regressed person who's not a bodybuilder, you might be like, all right, I want you to focus on having protein with every single meal you have, right? And it's like, that might be as much information you give that person until they tick that off or kind of become aware of it. And then they might come to you for the next bit of information. Or you're like, all right, you've done that. I'm now going to give you a little bit more. But with the bodybuilder, it's like they're prepared to do, counting calories, counting macros, maybe counting micronutrients, maybe meal timing, maybe frequency, maybe a certain amount of meals, maybe modulating that through the week with, high days, low days, non-training days, training days. You can go a lot more aggressive with these type of people. And I think that when it comes to kind of giving them a little bit of what they need, you kind of drip feed it a little bit slower than someone who's been the latter, where they're kind of like a chronic pain person. And I think with the chronic pain person, there's a different form of buy-in. And I think that's a lot more psychological. And I think it's kind of been like trying to understand where they've come from, what occurred around the time that they got injured, and a lot of the beliefs that they've developed, or maybe been conditioned by other practitioners, other influence, maybe Dr. Google, where there's potentially a lot of hesitancy. Because if they've had pain for a long time, you can't go ham, even if they have that. Maybe in the past they used to go ham with like their training. You can no longer do that approach because there's a lot of hesitancy. So I think with that person, you kind of go back to the nutrition where it's like, I'm going to give you a little bit and I want you to get confident, and you're either going to come back wanting more, or I'm going to give you a little bit more when you've kind of ticked that box. And I think that's where, getting someone to do a movement pattern that they might be fearful of, showing them that they're going to be okay, and then ingraining that confidence, I think is kind of like the starting point, and it's giving them a lot more of what they need and a little bit less of what they want. And I think that's kind of where the two individuals really kind of like are separate, is because of getting to know who they are as a person, and obviously the presentation. And that's why, you should treat every individual differently, because while they could be the same individual, A1 and A2, both bodybuilders, but one has that presentation and the other doesn't, even though they're the same person, you got to treat them differently. What about yourself? Is that similar? Would you challenge any of that thought process?
Yeah, so I guess I look at it very similarly and also quite differently in some ways. I think the understanding, and we spoke about this in a past episode when we discussed client psychology, understanding how they will perceive their environment, perceive the situation, perceive the intervention is really, really important, right? And then, so on that, it's really important. I find for me, it's really paramount to assess and analyze them as they're speaking, as I ask the questions, gauging their responses. It might be like a nonverbal response. They might sort of cringe a little bit, or they might sort of frown a little bit, or they might, I don't know, open their eyes or squint a little bit. These are all little kind of gestures, unconscious gestures that kind of indicate how they're feeling, I find. So that's one thing that's really important, because once I start to see that, and I start to gather that information, perhaps more the non-verbal information, but also the verbal information, their tones, the way they speak, the let's say like the intensity or the energy or lack of energy with which they respond, though all those sorts of things make a massive difference. And when you get someone who comes in and discusses their pain and goes, yeah, just got this fucking problem, like feel like I've been struggling for ages, man, it's been like 5 years, but yeah, should be right. And you can you can pull the reins in on that person, but you can probably also, you can play their game a little bit, right? Because it sounds like if they've had a problem for a number of years, they probably need to be told something pretty serious to get it a little bit more in line. But you can also perhaps do it in a slightly more informal way that's going to resonate with their personality and probably what they want. Whereas if you get someone who comes in and is more timid and quite fearful, I'd be conscious not to speak too loud. I'd be conscious to really focus on the wording and to really look to empower them as quickly as possible, and in as many different ways as possible. And so the example that you had of getting them to do an exercise that they might be fearful about, and then just showing them and using that essentially to prove to them that they're not damaged and that they're totally okay. And even going one further on that, actually just getting them to do the exercise, saying nothing, or even better, getting them to think about something else. You ask them a question, be like, I don't know, how does your, just to get them to focus on their breathing. If you kind of notice they're not particularly a great breather, and say they've got knee pain or back pain, and then they're so consciously focusing on their breathing that they forget to think about their knee or their back. And then after you go, how's your back? And they go, yeah, fine. Why? And like, yep, okay, well, you wouldn't have done that. So now I've just proven to you that you can, right? So there's so many different ways to go about it, but I find as early as possible, asking them what they want, so that the what's the word I'm looking for? The expectations, have been set very early. And I tend to be pretty direct and blunt, man. Like I'll just say to someone, I'll ask them about I'll go through the subjective assessment or the questions, and then I'll poke and prod a little bit to get the extra information I want or feel is necessary to that situation. And then I'll basically say to them, okay, what do you want? Like, what do you expect from me? How can I help you? I find just being quite direct, it also sets a certain, I'm not always like that, but I find that just being like that, it cuts out a lot of the bullshit and just gets us to where we need to be a little bit quicker. Some people are kind of a little bit shocked, and then I'll just giggle and smile and show them that I'm not being that serious. Like, I'm serious about the question, but I'm not that serious as a person or a personality. But sometimes I just say, all right, well, what do you want? What do you want me to do for you? What's the expectation here? And as soon as you get that out, it starts to really add I would say, a more productive note to the process. So from the get-go, kind of no fucking around. This guy means business. Let's just get the stuff done.
Yeah. And I think being direct is extremely important, especially with those timid people you mentioned about the words. And I think you're spot on, because there's times where someone comes into the clinic and you can just tell by the words that they use. And words are so powerful because, I was doing this thing the other day, and it's like, I hope I remember it, where it was like, I want you to visualize something and I want you to say, I hope that happens. Now, I've completely forgotten the next part of the story, but it was like, and then I want you to expect it to happen. And how does that make you feel when you say hope versus expect? And it's a completely different way you feel, but also changes the way you envision what you envision. And when you hear someone come in and the words they use, and you can just see that it's very negative, it's very apprehensive, there's a lot of fear there, you sometimes have to change your approach. And when I do that, I completely rule out any diagnosis. I don't use diagnosis. I don't use anything that they could go and Google and look up, or things that could make them a lot more fearful. I kind of like try to make it all sunshine and rainbows, because they want reinforcement that they're not going to get better, or that they're in a bad place and this sucks. And I think that's something that's extremely important to pick up on. But also, when you're talking about being direct, is sometimes you'll find, and listening is the most important thing with our job, but sometimes you need to pull them up and not let someone ramble. Because sometimes people want to ramble. They want to go on these tangents, and you got to kind of like hold them, be like, nope, get them back on track and get to the point, kind of like, as you said, because sometimes these people will just talk and talk and talk, but it's not proactive for both of us. It's not giving us more information that's going to help. It's just going to further reinforce that they don't believe they're going to get better, or they don't feel like they're in a good position to get better. So I think, I think being direct, and that's something that I think I struggle a little bit with, is that sometimes I'm a bit soft on the edges, where I won't go bang unless it's a very specific, particular client. And I think that's with bodybuilders, you can be a lot more like, straight up, be like, nah, that sucks type thing, or be very direct and be like, nah. Whereas I feel like other individuals, it's sometimes hard to be quite direct, because you don't want to come across in the wrong way.
Yeah, you don't want to offend them. You don't want to come across like an arrogant dick or anything like that. And
just an arsehole, yeah.
That was the other word I would have used. Yeah, yeah. It is a very, very interesting topic, because there's so many nuances to it. And what's super interesting about this topic, now that we're real deep into it, is that none of this stuff gets discussed at uni. I did some communications topic at uni, which is completely, I don't know, it's completely fucking useless, really. But now that you think about that, like, I focus so much on communication. I think communication can solve virtually every problem in the world. And when, it's something I focus on massively, like in terms of relationships as well. Like, but sometimes it means biting my tongue and not just letting out, what the ego wants to, or reacting as the ego wants to. And sometimes it means just listening. And I got to say, one thing that this podcast has taught me, man, is to really listen. Like, I listened back to the first podcast or the first episode or two, and I just kept saying like, yeah, or just trying to jump in because I was super excited. And I just, it was such a profound, it was such a profound learning, because I didn't like how it sounded. So since then, I've just been really focused on listening, not just during the podcast, but also, yesterday my parents were here visiting, and my dad was telling a story, and I was super keen to add my part to the story. And I was like, no, just listen, hear it out. And at some point I did jump in, but I try to really, when I felt it was more necessary, and I tried not to just jump in and get too excited, rather hear him out. And you relate that to the clients or patients that we've been working with. It's such a similar scenario, or it's more or less exactly the same. And you're right in the sense that sometimes we do have to cut them off, just to make sure that they don't ramble down the wrong road. But generally speaking, I think it's really important to hear them out and listen to them. Yeah. Because what happens is, when we ask a question, and this is one thing I've really noticed recently discussing, various things just with my family, because we've had loads to catch up on and we've had loads of interesting stories to tell, is you ask a question which is related to that topic or to the story, which then rolls into another topic or story, and all of a sudden you never got back to the initial topic or question, or really you never really finished unpacking that. And I find that is something that's really important. That's where listening is super, super important. Listening, observing, and almost analyzing. And then, as we said, using the right terminology and the right tone, but also having a human feel to it. Like one thing that, again, you just don't learn in uni is that, we're all the same type of human, but we're all very, very different in the same way. And that within itself, and this goes sort of back to the communication side of things, that within itself, in my opinion, is a real art. And there's got to be some real nuances in the communication strategies, the tones, almost like the different personalities or shirts. So, the metaphorical party shirts or business shirts that you put on for the different person. That's so important. How do you find that?
In terms of like kind of putting on different personalities depending on the client, or
yeah.
I think it's one of the reasons why our job can be so draining, but in a good way. And like draining has a negative connotation to it, but it's because you have to be present and you have to listen and you have to kind of take on that person's kind of energy and how they tell the story, because, you have those clients where their energy are up and about, but then you also have the other clients where you have to show a lot of empathy and you have to show your understanding, and you can see the impact that it's had on their life. And you got to be able to kind of go to their level. Otherwise it's going to be a bit weird if they're kind of like, sharing their struggles with you and you're like, you're up and about, you're like, yeah, sweet, no worries. Like, it's not going to come across the right way. And I think having to mold into these different personalities or masks or meet them where they are at, it can be quite tiring. And like, that's why, like, at the end of the day, sometimes you don't feel like socializing. You just kind of got to be like, digest, have a breath, be like, wow, that was a big day. And I remember a mentor, Andrew Locke, saying, he's like, after a day, it's like, I just turn off my phone, because he's like, I've just been so present and I've given like my energy and to be there and to listen. It is quite, I guess, draining, but again, not in a bad way. It's just what's involved, I think, in this profession.
That's how it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing I learned here once I started working in German. So when I moved here, I could speak good German. Like I could, I'd say it was pretty fluent. But then once you start working, in injury rehabilitation and with pain and with different presentations, there was a shitload more to learn, because that in itself is virtually its own language, right? And so luckily, deriving from Latin, a lot of the words are really similar between German and English. So that was really helpful. But just getting across what I needed to sometimes, whilst also perhaps making linguistic mistakes for those that, really needed it. And I saw a lot of people, particularly around the COVID lockdown time about a year ago, that people that were just really suffering mentally and physically. And to be able to, kind of show them that I was there to just basically put that metaphorical arm around their shoulders and just like, yeah, well, I'm with you. That was super, super important. And it meant that I had to really, really think about my communication strategies, particularly in a different language. It's not my native tongue. And that was a really, really interesting experience. It started initially, obviously, when I first started working in German, trying to actually be able to say what I needed to say. And there were a lot of words that I just didn't know that I had to, really learn quick, smart. And then grammatically, it's a different language. It's a massively different language. But anyway, and then trying to actually have the empathetic and the kind of show the emotional side in that language was a really, really interesting experience, because it's not easy, and people don't think about that, right? Like, we're talking about how difficult it is to be able to do that just generally in your native tongue. And some people can do it, and some people are just not good at it, and that's okay. They have strengths and supreme qualities elsewhere. But yeah, that was a real learning for me too. I just wanted to add that on because it just stimulated so many different parts of my brain, I guess, and made me think so much more deeper about how important communication is in our profession and just generally.
Yeah, wow.
You don't need to be that good at a language, actually, I think, to be really good at getting your point across. So the question then becomes, how simply can you do that? And that's also, I know I'm going on a little bit of a tangent here, but fuck it. That kind of also made me realize like how little can you cue to get what you need across to them, or how well can you just set things up? Can you set the environment, the situation, the task, the individual, all of it? How well can you set it up so that regardless of how good or bad your language skills are, you can just get your point across as you need to? And in theory, like I kind of wish every coach or practitioner would have to experience it, because it makes you really think critically about like the shit you might say. And we all do it to an extent. We all get really excited and we all ramble, and we all have that, that element of the ego that wants to just kind of let out their own story and blah, 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 which is totally fine. It's only human. But it's a real lesson in communication and let's say like client or patient management and negotiating, I guess, their emotions in order to get the outcomes that you want for them. So super interesting topic. Yeah.
Yeah. That as someone who absolutely sucks at German, I couldn't even imagine
German or English.
Because there was times, a bit of both, to be honest with you. It's like when I was dating my ex, who was Swedish, and she wanted me to learn Swedish, and I was just like, oof, man, it just wasn't happening for me. But that being said, like I think the key that you said was, it's one thing to be able to break down and articulate when someone asks what's going on in your own foreign language, I mean, but to do it in a language that's not, I guess, that comes naturally, you really would have to be like, how can I articulate this in a way that understands, but also in a way with my finite, I guess, words that I have to use. So I think that's, it's extremely impressive, man, because I think that's one of the hardest things in our profession is, how can you break down what is going on in a way that they understand? And I think that's one thing that unis tried to get across was, you got to use words that, was it jargon? Is that the words they usually use? That kind of like, jargon. Yeah, that's it. You got to avoid jargon. But I don't think they kind of emphasized it enough, because you might have one condition that you're very good at explaining, but then someone walks through the door and their knowledge of the human body or anatomy or anything is completely non-existent. And it's like, how can I get them to understand, not just, yep, because you see that sometimes, but in a way that they could then relay that information. And I think that in itself is quite a energetic process, because you have to really think about the words you're going to use, but then you also got to think about where they're at in terms of someone who's very apprehensive. Is the words I'm using going to reinforce their apprehension, or is it going to make them feel better and more confident and empowered? So yeah, man, it's a very draining process. And I think that like kind of goes on well to like where we also wanted to talk about is goal setting and kind of how to set up a client for success. Because no matter who you're working with, I believe you should create a game plan, and that someone should know or have some rough idea about where they're going. And it's not that just this, all right, I need to see you this many times to potentially get you out of pain. It's like, why do you need X amount of sessions, and how do you kind of go about setting that person up for success? So my question to you is, how do you kind of go about the goal setting or setting up that initial consult for further consults and for getting them from A to B and setting up that game plan? Like, how do you go about things?
So I think one thing that I've always tried to do, or at least particularly over the past few years, is to really outline, figure out what their end point is. I mean, that should be pretty obvious as a coach. So figure out what their desired endpoint is or their desired goal is, right? Let's say like their end goal. Then you can start to reverse engineer it from there. So you work backwards and you figure out the steps from there. That's one thing. The second thing is to try to really understand what they actually want. So one thing is a goal, but another thing is actually kind of understanding that goal. Do you know how I mean that? It's like, so they might say like, I want to be able to play with the kids again. You'd be like, yeah, cool. Okay. They want to be able to, I don't know, pick their kid up or something. But it's like, no, okay, what does playing with the kids mean? For one person, it might be playing Lego. The next person, it might be actually playing 2 hours of soccer out on a Saturday afternoon. They're totally different requirements, right? So that means that all of a sudden you have to add, you have a bit more context, which might inform your decisions around programming and training and the rehab process for them. The other thing I think is, so firstly, let's just summarize that. So having an endpoint and reverse engineering it into sub goals, and clearly, ideally clarifying how long it might take roughly. So, I mean, I think just putting definite timelines and everything is naive. But if you give people a rough structure and say, this is what I anticipate, obviously it depends how you respond to the initial intervention, blah, blah, blah. I think that's a pretty good way to get them on board. The second thing I find, and this is something I'd say I'm pretty good at, is at the end of each session, just doing like a little session recap and just showing them and really highlighting and reinforcing in a summarized version the progress that they made within that session and what that progress is going to allow them to do over the next week or two. So say, yeah, okay, you learned how to hip hinge today, how to move through your hips rather than just extending your knees or like on the way up, or just using your back and arching your back or rolling your back. So now that means that we can start to integrate that into a full body movement, which is going to get you back on the pitch. Just as an example off the top of my head. So, because then they can start to what's the word I'm looking for? To sort of conceptualize that, and it adds a sort of a bit more context within their personal picture. And then I think the one thing that I've struggled with, or I'm really conscious to get better at, is when someone does have quite a serious issue or movement problem, to actually be really upfront as early as possible and just say, look, this is going to take a while. Whereas I think I've probably gotten a little bit excited and thought, yeah, let's see how quickly, I can make some positive change. But the problem with that is what you're thinking might be really different to what the client is perceiving or hoping for. So that's where I've noticed in the last year or two, man, I've definitely perhaps made a couple of errors that I'm really conscious of now, which is it's good that I made those mistakes then in that sense, to learn from them. So yeah, that's definitely how I'd go about it. Firstly, reverse engineering. Secondly, showing them the next step, showing the progress based on that that last session, and then also just outlining it again. How about you?
Yeah, well, it's very similar. And I think there's a few things that I think I've learnt myself. And the first one, obviously, with the importance of reverse engineering. And there's a few examples where, let's just say someone has knee pain, they want to get back to running. And you, throughout the session, you do a certain exercise, and maybe it's on the ground, and they have quite a lot of difficulty. And if you kind of say to them, look, in order to run, you probably need to be able to hop or skip. And then if you can skip, you then need to be able to hop. And then you need to probably be able to do something standing, and then maybe go from reverse that back to maybe a half kneeling saying, and then you're on the ground. And you'd be like, well, can you see that you have quite a lot of difficulty doing this exercise? And if they say yes, be like, and if they want to go back to running straight away, you can be like, well, in order to be able to run, you need to be able to do X, Y, Z. And you're having a lot of difficulty with this. Running is kind of going from 0 to 100. Can you now see that we're not quite there? And I think when you paint that out, and I talked on a previous podcast about it makes sense, you suddenly start not dissolving someone's unrealistic expectations, but you start bringing them on a realistic ride, and it helps them kind of be like, all right, I now see where I am, but it also motivates them to do the homework and the rehab stuff, which leads me on to my second kind of learning in the last kind of like 18 months is, I think when I started out, I was very big on not giving people enough sessions. I would be like, all right, I want you to do this and let's touch base in like 2 to 3 weeks. If you do the work, that should be enough time. You shouldn't need more guidance if you touch base in the videos that I make sure you're doing the right technique. But I think sometimes as a coach, a therapist, or someone in charge, you need to kind of take the reins a little bit more and kind of like look at that individual and be like, are they really going to probably be as compliant as you would like them to be? Like, what is optimal and what is realistic? And sometimes being like, I need to see you in a week, just so that they have that initial compliance, they're more motivated to do it so they don't fall off the wagon. Because I think what I learned early on was I'd say 2 to 3 weeks. They'd be like, yep. Then they'd kind of like put it at the back of the mind because there was no urgency. And then when we touched base, they weren't where I'd expected them to in 3 weeks. And if I'd maybe said, let's see you in a week, we could have like got ourselves back on track and kept that momentum going. And I think that would have been a better service. Even though it's more sessions, it would have got them to where they needed to go a lot faster. And I think that was kind of like what I wanted to say. My third point is kind of seeing where someone is at, because, you know, with that bodybuilder, you might just need to give them the game plan and they go away and they do it and they execute and they don't need to be touching base that much. But with another individual, they might need a lot more guidance and kind of like check-ins and accountability. And that's where kind of like tailoring it really to that individual is going to make a big difference. Because like, as you would know, there's no magic exercise if they don't do it. There's no magic exercise if this person has a lot more barriers to work with. And that's another thing that I learned was in the beginning being like not wanting to take things away from people and be like, yeah, if you do this, you can do that. But sometimes I think you need to be direct and stern and be like, look, that's too much interference to where you are right now. And I think that's something that I know a lot of things that have shaped me, and I guess in not so positive ways. Like you hear a lot of therapists that just want to see people all the time and they're doing it from a business standpoint, not necessarily because that person needs it.
Sickening.
And the other thing is, yeah. And then the other thing is you always hear that people take things away from people that they love. And you're like, I don't want to be that guy either. And while there is 1,000 tools you can do to modify, give variance, change things up, do something that's very similar to enable that person to keep doing what they love to a degree, I think sometimes you need to be like confident enough to be like, hey, not right now. And realize that that's not doing a disservice, but it's actually going to get that person back to that thing a lot faster than trying to play this balancing act of, yeah, you can, but because unless you have full reins of things, it's very hard. I found it. And that's what I think for 2022 is I think I'm going to be taking the reins a little bit more and being like, I want to control all the variables, and having certain people manage different variables, I think can also be doing a disservice to the person.
Yeah. I think it's all about how it's communicated and how it's framed. So I'll either just, so when someone asks me, oh, should I still run, whilst I'm doing these exercises, I try to allow them to do everything possible or as much as possible, right? One, obviously the mental side, they'd like to do it, but also more physically, there's let's say there's generally benefits to most of the stuff, most of the things that they're doing. When there's not benefits, when it's actually detrimental, that's when you have to ask the question. The biggest question for me that tends to come out of that, well, there's two really. One, is it generally detrimental? Like, is it just shit for them? I would say that's actually a very unlikely scenario, or quite an unlikely scenario, but it may happen, and that's where you just have to communicate that very clearly and with examples, because people don't resonate with our talk the way we speak. They resonate with examples that are relevant to them, so that they have context with their life. Nothing else matters except for context to their life, in my opinion. The second thing is, if someone does say to me, oh, whilst I'm doing these exercises, if I'm doing, these daily exercises or your strength program 3 times a week, strength and rehab program, should I still maybe go for a couple of runs? I might say for the next week or 2 weeks, let's hold off on the running. As much as I don't like to, let's just hold off just very briefly, just to see what effect we get. Because the challenge is if they're not better, but you're quite confident that they should have some form of, significant or clearly measured progress, and they don't have it, then often it begs the question, what else is playing a role? I mean, obviously the intervention can be crap, but I'd like to think that we're past that in the vast majority of scenarios. But I think that the question is what intervention may be interfering with that, or what modality of exercise or movement or loading. So it's never easy, because I think you and I, again, we like to be quite proactive and aggressive with rehab, just generally, and allow people to do as much as possible to really empower them and show them that rehab isn't passive sitting down like a lot of people think. So it's all in the communication, it's all in the context, and I guess framing it for their benefit, making it relevant to their life, and also just empowering them through, I guess, that empathy and emotional connection.
Yeah. And I think that if you are going to try and push the boundaries, and you might have athletes that need to compete on the weekend, or they can't afford to have rest, I think that's where the game plan and communication needs to be even stronger, because it's like, if we're going to do this, there's no margin for error. It's like, you need to do this, and this, and you need to put in the right interventions, the amount of rest. You need to be like, if you're going to do this, it's no more than this. Like, you need to do this at a certain percent, etc. Because I think that with a general person, there is always a margin of error, even though we don't really highlight that. It's like, I want you to go aggressive. I want you to do these things daily. But I know at the back of my head, if they don't do it daily, it's not going to necessarily be a negative thing. But when you're trying to balance this act of doing and continually what you love, you need to follow that game plan, and there's not much margin for error. Because when you're playing that game, the risks increase and they need to be calculated. And that's where the communication needs to be even stronger. It's like, I need you to potentially video everything you do. I need you to report back how you feel afterwards and the next day. And I think that if you don't feel like you're getting that communication or form of commitment with someone, then you, as a practitioner, a therapist, a coach, has to kind of weigh up, is it worth for that person letting them have a little bit more control, or do you be like, nah? And that's where I think, it comes down back to that, who's the individual in front of you.
Yeah. And how you're communicating that all. Just, that's got to be, I think that's a perfect example of where you've got to be super clear, super blunt, and super direct, and just be like, look, if you want to perform on the weekend, this is what you have to do. Send me a video of every exercise, please. Message me in the morning, or even better, I'll message you as a reminder if you can't think about it, if you can't think it up, to let me know how you recovered, because that will dictate the next day. Otherwise, we might go down the wrong path, and then you're not going to the path of a successful weekend, but going on the path of a shitty weekend. So, you might be a little bit more eloquent with the discussion, that conversation. But I think just us discussing it now, you kind of highlights, you've got to be pretty direct with it. So yeah, man. Yeah. It's good way to wrap up the pod. Another one done, my man. We're flying. So I've absolutely got to hit the toilet. I'm dying to pee. I don't know about you, but last week was really funny. We both just ran away for like 5 minutes.
As soon as it's done, we're out.
Something no one talks about with One Take Podcast, but it's a serious issue that I'm trying to find a solution for. But anyway, we'll figure it out by next week, hopefully. So it's great to chat once again, man. Great to chat.
Pleasure,
man.
man.
Topic that we're super passionate about. Have a lovely evening, and we'll be back on next week.
Take care.
The Between Two Lines podcast, talking about performance, life, and everything in between. Featuring your hosts, Jonny Stahl and Ash Hamilton.